Welcome to The Call to Rise, the podcast for sacred rebels, visionaries, and conscious changemakers. Here we sit down with the people birthing the new earth, weaving ancient wisdom with modern strategy to build movements that heal, transform, and uplift our world. I'm Mackenzie Darling, your host, inviting you into honest conversations, practical tools, and hard-won wisdom to awaken your power and to inspire you to answer the call to rise and to meet this moment in history. Welcome, everyone. We have a really special guest today, and it's extra special because I've actually known Brittany Janis since eighth grade or something?
Something like that. A very long time.
Something like that. A really long time. And your mom, I've known since I was in fourth grade when she came down to the lower school and helped me get prepared for a speech that I needed to do. Shout out to Gay Janis, who continues to be my favorite teacher of all time. And I think everyone's favorite teacher who was in speech and debate back in the day at Gilmore Academy. Shout out Lancers.
Go GA.
Yeah, go GA. So yeah, it's really special to have you on here, Brittany, and wanted very much to have someone on that was well-versed in environmental climate change and impact. This conversation is incredibly important and incredibly dire right now. And I'm sure you have so much to offer our listeners, as well as just your background on nonprofit management. So lots to unpack here. So welcome.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. I'm really excited for the conversation. And it is always fun for long ago middle school, high school connections to come up in like the real like adult world.
That's I know so this too. Adult world that we're pretending to be in.
Exactly.
Well, you were brilliant back then and you're brilliant now. So really excited to dive deep here with you. For everyone listening, I want to read Brittany's bio to have you get a flavor of who she is and where she's coming from. Brittany Janis is the executive director of the Open Environmental Data Project and a founding member of the Public Environmental Data Partners Coalition. She advances open, equitable environmental data systems that empower communities and inform climate action. Previously, she was Associate Director of the Environment and Natural Resources Program and the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and led its Arctic Initiative. A coalition builder, she founded Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment and serves on the Women's Environmental Women's Network in San Francisco Board and the HKS SF Alumni Board. Her background includes nonprofit leadership and fundraising, including Major Gifts Officer at Environmental Defense Fund and President of AFP Golden Gate. She holds an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School, an MA in Philanthropy and Development from St. Mary's University of Minnesota, and a BA from Case Western Reserve University. She lives in San Francisco, along with me, and Western Massachusetts. All right, amazing. Well, as I said, you were always brilliant. Not surprising that you landed in so many terrific and very important roles. I want to start off the conversation with you mentioned open resource and equitable environmental data. Can you talk about like open resource and what makes it equitable within your work?
Sure, absolutely. So Open Environmental Data Project is focused on making it easier for communities to be able to access the data that they need to make decisions about their everyday life. Mm-hmm. So what is the air quality where they're living? What's in their water? Are there things that they need to worry about when it comes to wildfire or flooding and all of that kind of information? So there's sort of three different levels that we work at. The first is we work with communities, environmental justice organizations that are on the ground to help build their capacity to do their data stewardship better. And basically what that means is if they're going to do a citizen science program, if they are interested in understanding pollution in their air nearby and they have little sensors, how do they collect that data in a way that not only allows them to achieve advocacy goals, but also is respectful of their community, protects their community from their data not being exposed in ways that they don't want, and creating data sharing agreements. So we have a tool called the Community Data Playbook that we created that is specifically for environmental justice communities that are trying to do their own citizen science projects, community science-based projects, that gives them some of the frameworks to do that. So that's one level that we work at. The next level is at the researcher level. Lots of researchers like to come in from universities and different academic institutions to be able to get the research that they need to be successful in getting published. That may or may not actually benefit the community. When it's done right, it can. When it's done in a way that can be extractive, the researchers can take it back and get it published, and it doesn't actually end up helping that community at all. And as it said in my bio, I've done a lot of work in Arctic communities, working with, Alaskan natives or folks from the Association of World Reindeer Herders in the circumpolar Arctic. And a lot of times what we'd hear is, these researchers want to come, they want to study us, but they don't necessarily help us achieve the goals that we want for our communities when it comes to having better, sewage treatment, having less windmills on herding grounds, et cetera. And so one of the places where we try to work is with researchers and say, hey, it's absolutely important you do climate research. It's absolutely important that you do this work. But how do you meaningfully work with the community so that your research that you're going to get published actually leads to the community achieving objectives that are also valuable to them? So it's a mutually beneficial relationship as opposed to something that's extractive. And then the last area we work is trying to make it easier for communities to access the information that government is already collecting so that they can use that in their decision making, or they can use it for advocacy, or they can use it in litigation. So until recently, the federal government collected, and they still do, but collects lots and lots of various environmental data, most of it through regulatory processes. And a lot of times the government will collect that data, but it won't necessarily be easily usable by community members. It'll be in a PDF. It won't be easily searchable. The terms used will be very complicated. There won't be a good way to search it. And so what we try to do is work at that community government interface, either at the state, local, or federal level, and say, hey, you're collecting this data. It could actually be really valuable for these different community groups. How can we work with you to actually make it more open, more accessible, more interoperable, so that if communities actually want to use this for decision making, any of those different things, they can access it. The other thing that we've been doing a lot of recently through Public Environmental Data Partners, which is the coalition that I work with a bunch of folks to get off the ground, is also just protecting that data collection and the data that the federal government does collect. Since the last election and the Trump administration has taken over, lots of tools that communities use to be able to access this data have been taken down or deleted. Some data has been stopped being collected whatsoever, like the greenhouse gas reporting program. They're ending that. So that means there's over 4,000 different industrial sites that no longer have to report on what's going into the air or how all of the things that they're doing are impacting the communities around them. And so that's a reporting requirement that has since gone down. And so at PEDP, we're doing a few things. One is just archiving the data that the federal government has had so that people don't lose access to that. We're rebuilding tools that the federal government has taken down that researchers and communities have used. And then we're also trying to both rebuild a better future based on the kind of advocacy we were doing before this administration came in to talk about, like, how should our data systems look to actually be driven by community needs as opposed to industry needs or something else. And also thinking about broadly the advocacy, like the importance of government caring about environment, the importance of government collecting environmental data for the purpose of the people and trying to not gut the US science apparatus and climate science and all of those things, which have been for the last year under quite a bit of duress. So that's sort of a broad picture of the work we do.
First of all, thank you so much for the important work that you do. And it really sounds like you're in right relationship. I really admire that you're working with these communities in what they want and not being so extractive first. So that is amazing. And then, yes, I mean, it's never been more important to be archiving this information within this Trump administration How is this administration affecting your work, affecting people that are coming into climate change in general?
Yeah, I would say ever since basically last November, but certainly since January, it has been a bit of a fire drill for most people who work in the environmental space, not just in the data space, but broadly in environment. So, to give you a sense, the basically the entire Office of Environmental Justice at EPA, everyone who worked there was either reassigned or let go. They just closed down that office entirely. Anything that mentions environmental justice, anything that mentions race or equity or any of those things is being dismantled. And if you've seen the news, you can also see the downstream effects, right? So if you look at the Build Back, the big, beautiful bill, basically what happened with the passage of that is lots and lots of subsidies to do things that help make clean energy, accelerate clean energy deployment have been taken out. So money for communities, particularly low income communities, to be able to install rooftop solar is gone. Money for communities to be able to better do heat pumps, those tax credits are expiring. Similarly for EVs. So kind of anything that was about trying to advance our climate goals has been gutted on the mitigation side. And then on the adaptation side, communities are a lot less safe because, the Weather Service has had massive reductions in force. EPA has had massive reductions in force. FEMA has been drastically cut and is being reimagined. So anything that is focused on helping communities be able to prepare better and be able to respond better to the changes that are happening in climate has also been under threat. And I think we're starting to see the impacts of that, right? Like, particularly right now, because we're in the midst of the government shutdown, which is magnifying all of these problems even more. To look at what was happening with Hurricane Melissa, people had to come out of retirement and basically work as volunteers to be able to go in and actually understand what was happening with that hurricane. The flooding that happened earlier this year, part of the reason that some people are saying there might not have been sufficient warnings is because of reductions in EPA force. So, as much as there are challenges with the way the federal government is operated, and I think, people can generally agree, the federal government bureaucracy may not always have worked perfectly. It's still really important. Like, the work that these agencies do is really important. And the work of protecting people and having different programs that are thinking about how you reduce our emissions and also how you protect people from the changes that are happening and the climate change impacts. Those are all really important things. And the administration just has a very different view of the value of public service, which is why there have been all of these firings. And so that's sort of the broad landscape. But if you're at an organization that's working in environmental justice, like, a lot of those peers have lost big grants. Their funding has, been reduced. There's thousands of federal workers who are out of work and are looking for new roles. And yeah, I think there's a lot of, now a year in, I'd say there's a lot of innovation and trying to like hold stuff together with duct tape, and because there's a lot of smart people who work in this space, but it's exhausting too to see years and years of work starting, being dismantled or being set aside. And one of the things that I think has been most interesting about the public environmental data partners work we've been doing as we've been trying to save these tools and rebuild these data sets. We actually just published a story that looks at a bunch of the different research papers that were dependent on the tools that the administration has deleted. There's like 5 environmental justice tools that were taken down. And we just published it the other day, and we got a bunch of responses from people who are former EPA saying, thank you so much for doing this. Like, it's good to know that my work actually has been valued, that it actually did have an impact. Because if you were part of the federal government, or even if you still are, a lot of these people are being painted as villains or, ineffective and lazy. And like, that's just not true. And so it's been heartening to know that as we save these things and talk about the value of importance, like, people feel better. Their work actually was meaningful because it was.
Oh, it's so meaningful. You're doing such important work. I'm wondering, from your view, why do you think climate change is so politicized? especially coming from the data where it's showing us that climate change is real.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it could be politicized. I think the biggest one is that there's a lot of entrenched money and power in oil and gas companies, and they're big donors to, honestly, they're donors in some ways to both parties, but just disproportionately to the Republican Party. And the other thing is, when you listen to what this administration talks about when it comes to energy security and American strength, like, it is true that the US has a lot of natural gas underneath it, right? And it is true that there are different things that you can extract from the territory that is now called North America that allow people to make a lot of money fast. But there's generally a focus on what can allow me to make a lot of money now, as opposed to what are the long term investments and thinking that we need to do to make our lives more sustainable and to make our planet healthy and our communities healthy and all of those things. And so if you're interested in like get rich fast schemes, it's easy to say, oh, don't worry about climate change, or oh, it's a hoax, or oh, it's not as big a deal. And I think part of it is also, largely driven by the sense, and I don't think that this is entirely true, but people in the West who are wealthy have a sense that, well, no matter what, I'll be fine. Like, I'll be able to buy my way out of any climate disaster that happens. I'll be able to, rebuild my house if it gets burnt down by a fire, or I can install a seawall. And there isn't necessarily a recognition, one, of there actually is vulnerability for everyone because of this, but not only is there vulnerability to everyone, but there's particular vulnerability to people who are in the global south, people who are in still, the global majority, still developing nations. And those are the people who are going to be hit hardest, and in some cases first, by climate change. And so, if it's not your problem, you don't worry about it, then you can choose to ignore the realities of climate change. But if you care about the earth and you care about general humanity suffering, then it is something that everyone should care.
Before we go any further, I want to speak directly to the revolutionaries that are listening. The ones who know that their lives carry a deeper purpose of service in this moment. If you can feel that you weren't meant to simply succeed inside the old systems, but to help reshape what comes next, this invitation is for you. I've created the Movement Maker Archetype Quiz, a powerful tool that reveals one of 7 leadership archetypes emerging right now to guide us through this threshold moment in history. This isn't about personality. It's about discovering your unique leadership medicine, the role you're here to play in our collective transformation. You can take the quiz at quiz.globalmovementmaker.com. That's quiz.globalmovementmaker.com. If something in you knows this moment matters, start there. My eyes were opened wider during COVID when it was so clear to me how interconnected everything was, and you were able to see the different chains that were breaking down and how we really are global citizens. But this America first mentality feels still very, very strong, probably stronger than ever right now. And the work is to raise consciousness and be able to see that we're all global and interconnected for sure, especially when it comes to climate change, because we all live and breathe the same air and the same environment. I want to pivot the conversation a little bit because I would love to hear from you how you are using AI with your data reporting, first of all, and what's the opportunity for climate change with AI and data moving forward. And then obviously it has great impact on the environment. So would love to chat with you about the complexity of holding both of those things.
Yeah, it is a very complex topic. And, we try to live in a bit of nuance in that first of all, AI has been used for environmental stuff for a very long time, not LLMs, but like things like machine learning. There are bits and pieces of AI that are not ChatGPT that have long been used for assessing satellite data, right? And so I think one thing that sometimes gets confusing in this like AI buzz is there's like the large language models, there's the the chat bots that you're like talking to, and you can be like, write me a funny haiku. And then there's, deep data machine learning things. And so I think one of the things that we've been really conscious at OEDP as well as PEDP is we've been having lots of conversations around, okay, what are the things that we think is an appropriate use of AI? What are the things that we think are an inappropriate use of AI? And what are the new ways of thinking about AI that warrant its use versus things that we actually think are, it's still valuable to have a human be the person who's writing you an email. It's still valuable to have like a human connection there. And so we've spent a lot of work kind of having those conversations and trying to say, like, okay, if a small community-based organization is interested in doing small AI, where they set up their own models to do certain things and they are in control of the parameters and it's open source and they're able to do that, then like that could potentially accelerate their ability to analyze their data faster. And so we are actually, I would say, just starting to like really understand what are the different interesting ways that you can really root AI use in a community-centered approach in a way that respects data sovereignty, privacy, people's desires, and doesn't necessarily, it's not that it doesn't use data centers, because I mean, everything we use to a certain extent touches a data center, but it isn't necessarily the rapid amplification of like using LLMs for everything. I think the other thing that we're seeing is a lot of, particularly within environmental justice movements, very righteous concern about data centers coming into communities, not being transparent about how much water or electricity they're using, the noise pollution, et cetera. And so we have been part of a handful of different conversations. The K4 Center is doing some really fantastic research on data centers in California and looking at, here's what companies promised in terms of what it was going to do with jobs, electricity, et cetera. Were they able to live up to those promises? And I would say generally the answer is no. And so one of the things that I think is really important when it comes to thinking about AI regulation and, how we want to move forward, it's a freight train. We're not going to stop AI from, becoming more and more prevalent. And there are select ways where it can be helpful. But what do we need to do to be able to actually make the promises of AI live up to the hype, live up to the promises of what it will do for communities' jobs, for communities' benefits, to actually be open? I mean, the fact that OpenAI is called OpenAI, but they are not actually transparent about what data goes in to feed it, et cetera. There's a lot that can be done. And California has actually done a pretty good job. They just passed an AI policy, which has increased the transparency and understanding of those models. There is virtually zero interest right now in the federal government pursuing any sorts of regulations, but things around increasing transparency, making it easier for communities to know, like, if a data center comes in, what is that going to mean? Because originally, during the Biden administration, like part of the hope was that if you encouraged AI to happen, but you encouraged it to happen along with the infrastructure investments that were going to happen in clean energy, you would see a clean energy boom that would go along with the expansion of AI. I'm a little skeptical if that would have actually entirely panned out exactly the way that they had hoped, but there was potential, right, for clean energy to be powering AI so that it wasn't as big a impact on the grid, it wasn't creating so many emissions, et cetera. That's not what's happening now. Now AI plants are, because there isn't a push for more clean energy adoption, they're setting up their own natural gas plants in some cases. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity if these companies that are making billions and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, want to actually be good corporate citizens to model better behavior in these ways. Not that, not that these things are going to be entirely stopped, but there are ways to do development better that I think could meaningfully accelerate clean energy adoption, could meaningfully improve communities. Because I do think that there is potential that the scientific breakthroughs that might be able to happen, the research that could happen because of being powered by AI can move us faster towards climate change solutions. But if we don't develop the companies, and particularly that company's infrastructure, in a way that is aligned with sustainability practices, then you're not really walking the talk.
What would you suggest moving forward? What are going to be the biggest levers that we can pull?
I think the biggest levers are doing whatever kind of transparency we can on our own. So there's some folks who we have worked with who looked at data centers' water consumption, right? And so you can, as a researcher or as a community group, use Freedom of Information Act to request governments to give you information about how much water is actually being consumed or how much electricity is actually being consumed. You can put up noise monitors around. And so, right now, the strongest and most compelling research I have seen has been driven by small researchers and communities who are saying, hey, here's what they promised. Here's what it's actually looking like. This is a mismatch. Like, this is not what they're consuming more water than they said. Our electricity prices are going up. So amplifying those stories and talking about sort of how those impacts are not what was originally promised is probably the strongest lever for encouraging policy. And I mean, I think if you look at the different regulations that have happened around AI in California, the reason that they've happened is because tragedies have happened, right? Like, people have gotten in relationships with chatbots and, committed suicide and things. And that's part of what is driving that. So telling those stories and making it clear that we recognize that AI is probably not going to be stopped, but there's ways you can do it responsibly or more responsibly than it's currently being executed. And that requires a certain level of, governments giving guardrails to these companies and communities who are doing, permitting for data centers, like really knowing what questions to ask and asking those questions and demanding transparency from companies as to what's actually happening when they're building.
I want to pivot the conversation a little bit because there's just so much rich information that we could dive into. But, my audience are the change makers and people that are stepping in to help with these initiatives. And so I'd love to talk about your Public Environmental Data Partners Coalition and coalition building in general. Can you talk about the coalition? How is it built, and give step by step, like, how do you build a coalition and what are the biggest lessons learned when forming partnerships?
Yeah. Building PEDP has been a lot of fun in some ways. It's hard work and it's been crazy fire drills from time to time. But the thing that's been great, so back in November of last year, after the election, I said to my colleagues, like, hey, last time there was a Trump administration, we know that they took down a bunch of climate data, took down a bunch of climate websites. I think we should be prepared for this and start to think about what will be our plans and how are we going to protect this data, how are we going to protect environmental policy writ large. And so I reached out to some of my former colleagues at Harvard. They reached out to some of the various people who had been like longtime OEDP collaborators. Because for context, I started in my role as ED in September of last year. So I basically had 2 months under my belt. And so I'm like, all right, let's just figure out who's doing what. And so we relatively quickly formed a core group. There was some folks at the Harvard BU Climate Cafe who were working on this. There's folks at EDGI, the Environmental Data Governance Initiative, who in the last Trump administration did a lot of the tracking of what happened to environmental websites. And then there's folks at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center who also do a lot of work sort of at this data space. And they were in contact with folks in the Justice 40 Initiative and folks at Internet Archive and, a whole network of people. And so we just started having Zoom calls and saying like, okay, let's figure out who can do what. Let's set up a Slack. Let's set up a Google Drive. And we're all just going to start having calls and saying, what intel are you getting about what you know is going to be taken down? How do we archive it? How do we get volunteers involved? How do we, start talking about it? And so it was very much a building the plane as you're flying it thing. In this case, which is not necessarily always the best way to build a coalition, but it worked in this case. And so I would say the things that were important was these have sort of emerged as our values. It was sharing work and sharing credit. And so a lot of, okay, you know, who do you know? Who do we know? How do we make sure that we're being transparent about what our networks are, that we're sharing resources, that we're sharing the workload? Because we have folks from all over the US and also some folks up in Canada, we could do a lot of archiving for all of the hours that people in the US are awake. And so there was a lot of like tagging people in and being like, cool, I'm going to get this far. And now it's you, and a lot of asynchronous work. And I think the things that have been most helpful in terms of really building those strong partnerships is one, that sharing wins and sharing resources, being really committed to not ever making it about, hey, I did this, or taking more credit than what is due, to always tapping other people and trying to, point out like, oh yes, Epic was part of this, Edgy was part of this. Like, these are the people who, we're all doing this together. And like, even the way we've been doing fundraising for this, a lot of times organizations can be really protective of like, hey, these are my funders. But at the very beginning, we're like, okay, I know somebody here. I think that they might give us funding. Let's all work together on the proposal. Let's all be transparent about like what's going into it. And, let's invite them to a thing where all of the different people that are going to benefit from this are able to have a conversation, so that it hasn't ever been too territorial, which, can be hard when you're building a coalition, particularly in a moment where funding is getting cut elsewhere and like there's a lot of anxiety and insecurity. The thing that I think has been most heartening, we hosted a convening this past September out in Oakland of not just our coalition, but of sort of all of the different networks that are working on this, and talked about like, okay, there's if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so we've kind of the analogy that went through that is, we've been in a sprint, but what do we want to do together? How do we bring together different philanthropies and different groups? And so there's the PEDP coalition itself, but there's sort of this broader network of networks. And so we're really trying hard to say, how do we mutually reinforce each other's work? If I'm talking to somebody who's really interested in, for example, like greenhouse gas emissions data, I will say, hey, you might actually want to talk to the folks at the Data Foundation about that, because they're really interested in like thinking about emissions data specifically for the purposes of like carbon markets and things. And like, that's not exactly what we do. We're really more rooted in environmental justice. So lots of like passing people off to one another, making sure we know what other people are working on, and genuinely trying to build something bigger together, particularly in this time where resources are constrained, where there's so much work to do. Like, there's no lack of work to do. There is potentially a lack of resources, but if we work on these things together, then we actually can probably achieve more. And it's been heartening to see that has gotten people really excited and like more trusting of working with the coalition and all of the individual organizations that are part of that coalition, because they know that we are communicating with one another. We're not building redundant platforms, and we're trying really hard to like be as efficient as possible, but also as effective as possible moving this work forward.
Yeah, you're pointing to something really important, that we all have a piece of the puzzle. We don't have to hold the whole thing, and that hive mind, when you're bringing these different organizations together within their own specialties, then you don't have to be a specialist on everything. And there's more holistic view of the whole piece.
Yeah. We like to use the term sort of movement generosity. I love that. To what extent are we being generous with one another? And are we taking up work where, another one can't? And it's so far, knock on wood, it's been working really well. But it is a lot of work, and it is a little slower in some ways, because you do have to do the consensus building. You do have to take a step back and be like, okay, here's what we're going to say. Does everyone feel okay with this? Great. Like, let's move forward. But I think the extent to which you can get a lot further and get a lot more done, even if it is a slightly slower process, in some ways is worthwhile.
Every episode of the Call to Rise podcast is about the changemakers and movements reshaping our world. But the podcast is just the beginning. On my Substack, I open the door wider, sharing my personal journey with movement makers, the wins, the struggles, and the behind-the-scenes rituals that help leaders birth what's next. If you're ready to go deeper into the frameworks and practices you hear me hint at here, join me at globalmovementmaker.substack.com. There's different types of consensus modeling. Do you use a specific one? How do you work through consensus-based voting?
Yeah, so the way PDP is structured is we have a bunch of different working groups that are all doing different pieces of the puzzle. And then we have a steering committee that is ultimately the decision maker for any like big decisions that need to happen that have to come outside of the working groups. And that steering committee is made up of the coordinators of every working group, plus a few other like ad hoc members. And our voting structure is basically majority of who is present, working group members, and we have a quorum. I think our quorum is 8 people have to be present for a vote to be able to move forward. And so that has so far worked really well. And there's, a lot of things that the working groups can just do on their own. But if there's, a big question, it will go up to the steering committee. We also, most of what we did in some of the very early days was just setting up the governance infrastructure for like, what does this look like? How are decisions made? What are the decisions that have to go to steering committee? What can working groups do? And like deciding on all of those various governance frameworks. And then having people sign in to a volunteer onboarding. And as we do the volunteer onboarding, having them sign off on our shared values. And those shared values are working transparently, sharing credit, sharing work, and, a commitment to building public access and being willing to make sure that you're doing work out in the open. And so because it's sort of grounded in shared values and we have these governance structures set up, that took surprisingly the longest. Like we actually just finished building a new governance policy for exactly how, if you have a small project that needs funds, like what is the process that you go about like requesting that through the working groups and the steering committee. So there's lots of, mechanical details that need to be established, but because by putting in the work early to establish those and making it clear and having clear working agreements of how things will get done, it makes it easier down the road.
I really want to double click on that because having the values, that's such a large part of my movement maker incubator. And I think that actually is what establishes a movement when you are really clear on values, because then you're co-creating with people that all share a shared mission. And so that is really, really important. I also would love to get some of your wisdom around volunteer management and onboarding. What are some of your biggest lessons there? Because I know that can be a real tricky spot for people.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. We've had a lot of success with things like, we call them datathons, which is basically like, hey, here's a bunch of data sets we need downloaded. Come sit down. We've done that at universities. We've also done virtual ones. And you've just been like, try to get this data downloaded. Here are the instructions for how you do that. Here's where you put it. Here is the metadata or how you tag it so that it is all like useful. So those have been really successful because they're relatively rapid activations. So we have been like, the steps to doing that are pretty clear and straightforward. I think the biggest challenge that we have had, and we've been overcoming it, but it's taken some time, is if you have a volunteer who wants to regularly volunteer, how are you giving them enough freedom and flexibility to choose the work that is right for them, that they are best suited to do, that they are interested in, but they don't need to necessarily have to seek out that work, Is there right now what we're doing is we basically have a spreadsheet and we say like, this is a small, medium, large project. It requires these skills to achieve. And like, this is what you need to be able to do to have it. So I think that getting to that place where we were able to say like, here's what you need to be able to be successful at this. And this is the kind of commitment that it takes to be able to do this successfully took a little bit of time, because you actually need to know and like really look at, in this case, like how difficult is that data set to download? what are the metadata standards and all of these different things. And so I think one big lesson is making it easy for volunteers to get work done that matches their skill set. I think the other thing that we have been, pretty good at is trying to let volunteers be somewhat self-directed. So that story that I talked about that just got published, that was about all of the different research projects that use environmental justice tools. One of our volunteers worked on that project in its entirety. And so we had come up with a long list of different questions, uh, a long list of different questions for this series that we're calling Made Possible. And the Made Possible series is, what are the things that were made possible by having access to this data? And so, we were kind of like, here's a list of questions, choose your question. And then what is the support you need? But also, how do we not get in the way of you, being able to run with this? And so that's something that we did within sort of our advocacy communications working group, and, produced a beautiful thing. We were able to, allocate a little bit of the funding that we have for communications to hire a graphic designer, because we didn't have that skill set in our, in a volunteer basis. We had lots of good writers and data people. We didn't have somebody who would draw the most, beautiful illustrations. And so we hired an illustrator to help with that. And so I think the other thing that is very important for volunteers is not only you give them the space and the understanding of what they need to be successful, but you try to provide them the resources to be able to really amplify their work. And sometimes that's possible and sometimes it's not, but that has been another thing that I think has made it more rewarding. And then, obviously the most important thing is coming back to that sort of shared value of sharing work and sharing credit, trying to amplify, here's an amazing product that Ilham has made, and how can she really go out and talk to it and be proud about that in the world. And it's, a product that she made for a PDP, but lifting up her work and her skills and her research ability, because she did that entirely as a volunteer. And so, how can we make sure that she is really getting value out of her participation and not feeling oh, okay, I did all this research, but now it's a PDP product as opposed to a beautiful data story that I built.
It's such a big part of movement building as well, is to really empower people to step into leadership, to be able
Yep.
to co-create and spread this vision that you all carry together. So I
Yeah.
really, really love that. Any other final biggest lessons that you want to tell people? I mean, I want to talk to you so much about building a board and fundraising and all of these things. Maybe I'll have you on again because you're just a wealth of knowledge. But as we're winding down for this episode, what are the biggest lessons that you've learned that you think new aspiring change makers in this moment in time really, really need to hear?
I think the biggest things are, there are more people like you than you might think, and they all want to help you and help each other. And so thinking about, how do you really build your network, and how do you connect with people who share your values, who share your mission, who share your passion for the work? And, instead of seeing it as a competitive, the pie is only so big, think of it as, we can grow the pie together. And so building that network of people that you can be mutually supportive of, that you can work together on projects, even if maybe what you're building may be its own distinct thing. Having a network of other people that are building similar things, who you're connected with, can really help amplify your work and amplify your impact. And not being afraid to ask for help, I think, is the other big thing, because there are all those people out there who do want to achieve the same thing. I think the most important lesson I learned from all of the fundraising work that I've done is that when you are doing fundraising, it's not that you are asking somebody for money. You are asking somebody to join you in achieving a goal. And the way that some people can achieve that goal and achieve what they want to see in the world is by doing the hard work. The way some people can achieve the goal or the things they want to see in the world is by contributing money to it. But at the end of the day, you're all trying to achieve the same thing. And so the pride that should come for all of those people, and sharing that pride in the work that is done, is, I think, the the biggest like fundraising lesson is, yeah, it's not a transaction thing. It is a building a shared vision and like giving people the opportunity to participate in making the world a better place. And so like keeping that in mind, particularly when you're like early in movement making and you might feel awkward about like, oh, like I know a lot of people are like, I don't want to have to ask for help. I don't want to ask for money. I don't want to do all these things. But it's not a it's not an ask from a low power position. It's actually an ask from a high power position because you're giving people the opportunity to achieve what they want in the world. And you're giving people the opportunity to make a difference. And so sort of recontextualizing the idea of asking for help as like being in a place of weakness, but actually asking for help is like coming from a place of strength when you're doing this kind of work.
Oh man, I'm so glad that I asked that question because I just feel everything that you said so, so deeply. First of all, I think movement building can feel so incredibly isolating. And so I just really want to double click on the importance of not having to do this alone and reaching out for those partnerships and asking for that help. I mean, actually, you and I got reconnected for me reaching out and being like, hey, can I have an informational interview with you to learn the climate space more? Because my movement maker incubator, I think, could be great for this space, but I like need your knowledge. And so just by doing that, now we're reconnected. You're on my podcast. Who knows what's going to happen, right? But like it really, really opens those doors. So that's so important. And I love that you're pointing to don't ask for money, like be in vision together. And that's
Yeah.
pointing to the importance of storytelling.
Yep.
So many times, I talk to different climate activists or people in conscious tech, all of these things, and they go to the product, like what are they selling? And I'm like, wait, what's the heart of what you're trying to get at? Like, what is the problem? And tell me the story to get me in your vision. And so we didn't really have the time to chat about storytelling. Because that's such an important part of movement building. But, to all of our listeners out there, when you're pitching partners and when you're pitching funders, it's all about the story and the vision that you're trying to do. It's not the system that you're building.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. How can people get involved with your amazing work?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if you go on to screeningtools.org, or if you just Google Public Environmental Data Partners, there's actually a way to volunteer there. So if you're interested in getting involved with PEDP, as I said, we have a whole bunch of different working groups. You don't necessarily have to have deep data knowledge to be able to help, because we have an advocacy group that's, doing storytelling. We have folks that are doing tool development and data downloads, but there's lots of different ways to plug in. So that's probably one of the easiest ones, but you can also, go on to Open Environmental Data Project's website, openenvironmentaldata.org, check out the different work that we're doing. There's a contact form there, and feel free to reach out if you're interested, if you're a community organization that's interested in working on data better, or understanding, what are the things you should be thinking about. There's lots of resources on there as well. So those are, two good and easy ways. And yeah, please feel free. I'm always happy to hear from different people and to try to plug you in. If not to our organization, then to one of the many other organizations that we work in community with. So
Yes, your coalition.
yep,
Amazing. Well, this was just such a treat. Thank you so much, Brittany. I'm so happy to be reconnected with you, and thank you for the important work that you're doing. And look forward to maybe even more discussions on the podcast at a later time because there's so much to talk about.
absolutely. I'd love that.
All right, awesome. Thanks, guys, for listening. Tune in next week. Thank you for listening to The Call to Rise. If today's conversation stirred something in you, subscribe and share it with a fellow movement maker. And join our community at globalmovementmaker.com. Till next time, keep leading with courage, keep weaving ancient wisdom with modern strategy, and always remember to answer the call.